Just checking to make sure you can see my PowerPoint, not the presenter mode, correct? Just the plain one slide, right?
That's
Yes,
correct. Yes.
ma'am.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be joining you all, even if it is virtually. So, as was mentioned, a lot of people are starting to get pretty concerned, or maybe are already in the thick of being very concerned because of the price of fertilizer. Everything is more expensive right now, and fertilizer is no exception. So we'll just jump right in. So before we talk about fertilizer, let's talk about your soil and soil fertility, and that will hopefully help you understand how and if you need to fertilize and when. So soil fertility, what are we talking about there? Basically, that's the capacity of the soil to receive, store, and pass on nutrients to support plant growth. So your soil is not just a medium that holds your roots, right? Your soil has a lot to offer all by itself. And basically, when we talk about soil fertility, we're referring to the overall nutrient status of the soil and the ability of the soil to provide nutrients to your plants, and therefore onto you and your family, right? The components of soil fertility are not just chemical, it's not just nutrients, but also pH. There's a biological component, right? Microorganisms convert. There are processes that are happening completely out of our view, microscopic microorganisms that are converting nutrients from one form to another. And then there's the physical component, right? The mineral parent rock component that also could affect compaction and aggregation. Those are two huge things that are really important for plant growth and development. So any of you that have ever experienced compaction know, right, that your plants just do not perform very well. And so aggregate stability is a really important component, and it's all linked together. So nutrient requirements for all plants, right? The crop nutritional requirements are the same regardless of organic or conventional production practices. So the source of the nutrient is what changes depending on the production system, right? But nitrogen is nitrogen, phosphorus is phosphorus, right? There are different forms of these nutrients, but the plant does not distinguish between, oh, this was an organic source and this was a conventional source. Now the environment may, right? That's a whole nother component, and certainly your wallet may know the difference. So keep that in mind. So we have the macronutrients, the things you probably see a lot of on your soil tests: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then the micronutrients: iron, manganese, copper, zinc, molybdenum, boron, chlorine, and nickel. And so micronutrients are not less important, they're just required, just less of them are required, like less amounts of them are required compared to macronutrients. So macronutrients, we're usually talking in pounds per acre, right, when you see your soil test. And micronutrient might be parts per million or something like that. So we're talking about a lot less, still very important. Okay, so plant uptake of nutrients. The source of the nutrients is what changes depending on the production system, not the quantity needed or the quality, right? So, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Plants are only capable of absorbing nutrients in certain forms, regardless of the source. So nitrate or ammonium, things like that, right? That's what I'm talking about, these forms here, NO3 or NH4+. So plants do not distinguish or differentiate between organic and non-organic sources of fertilizer. The examples of the forms for plant uptake, right, would be, potassium is a K+, that's a positive ion. That's how the plant takes it up. Okay, so we've gotten that out of the way. So knowing your soil. So we talked about soil fertility. Now you need to understand what you're working with, right? And this, for vegetable production, we recommend at least once a year that you collect a soil sample. I recommend in the fall, so that helps you prepare for the spring. Things happen, your soil changes, and a lot of people get really caught by surprise in the spring when they pull a soil sample and they realize, oh, I need to adjust my soil pH. So for vegetable production, I would say at minimum, you should be collecting soil samples annually. And a routine soil test with UK includes pH, buffer pH, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc. Nitrogen is not included, and because that changes, nitrogen changes really quickly. So if you sampled in the fall for nitrogen or had it tested in the fall, it would not be the same in the spring. It's a very mobile nutrient. And so generally, unless you're just curious, for curiosity's sake, we don't test for nitrogen. And this amount may be a little outdated. I'm not sure what UK is charging now currently for counties, but that a couple of years ago, it was about $7. If you're in a high tunnel, for sure, request soluble salts test. That's the SS is the symbol or the acronym that they want you to use. And that we're not going to go into soil salinity too much because the focus is not on high tunnels specifically for this talk, but keeping track of that is really important if you're using a high tunnel. And then CEC and base saturation can also be helpful in determining your cation-ion situation, and which can affect your soil fertility and your plant available nutrients. So learn how to interpret the results of your soil test. So sit down with these wonderful county agents who have set up this program, right, and talk to them. If you don't understand how to interpret the report that comes back to you, sit down and have them explain things to you. The recommendations are on there for a reason. And if they don't understand something, they'll get in contact with me and we can talk it through. The idea of having a soil test is that you apply the nutrients needed based on your soil and the crop you intend to grow, right? And it's only those nutrients, so you won't over apply or under apply, right? So you can also do split applications of fertilizer, which we'll talk about later, specifically nitrogen, split applications of nitrogen. And the idea is that this will save you money because you're hitting that target, right? You're hitting exactly what you need to do to get your plants to be as productive as possible. That also prevents plant development issues, right? And in that theory, you would have better yield and therefore better prices for your crop, and all around a better economic situation there. The other thought is that you're literally not wasting fertilizer out in the environment, and it is more sustainable, not only for you, but also for the environment. So as I said, nitrogen is really mobile, and if you over apply and a hard rain comes, like we've had a lot of recently, that can get washed away and it goes somewhere. And so that's something to keep in mind. So how to collect a soil sample, right? Use a trowel or a shovel or a soil probe if you've got one. For vegetable crops, we typically collect from the soil surface to about 8 inches deep. You're going to collect from soil from several points. So if you've got a high tunnel, right, that would be your place to, probably just one high tunnel would be your place to measure. But if you're out in the field, you would probably want to collect a few soil samples, depending on how big each field is where you're going to plant something. So if you're going to have a 1/4 acre of cabbage, and a quarter acre of tomatoes, you may want to separate those and submit separate samples based off those locations. For each sample that you plan to submit, you're going to pull probably 8 to 10 soil cores or trowelfuls, and you're going to combine all that, mix them really well in a bucket with your hand. Don't use a metal bucket. And then you're going to take 1 to 2 cups of soil from the bucket and put it in that sample bag you've got. And so submitting more is not going to help. So I suggest just combining that really, really well and filling it up to that fill line. The lab will not use any more than what they say they're going to use. So even if you filled that bag up completely, they would just discard it. So make sure to mix your subsamples really well. Okay, so this is I know the lab now has a new soil test. I haven't seen too many of them yet this year. I'm looking forward to seeing a few more. But this was the old school version, the one of yesteryear. And the idea is the same though, I promise. So the crops to be grown, right? Tomatoes, it's really important, especially for fruiting crops like tomatoes or peppers, that you actually put this in there. And specifically for tomatoes, if you put this in there, you will get a Hart's ratio. And that is your potassium and magnesium ratio. And basically what that indicates is your risk for ripening disorders. And so if your magnesium is a lot greater than your potassium, you will most likely have an out of whack Hart's ratio, and your crop may be at risk for ripening disorders like yellow shoulder or blotchy ripening or white core, things like that. Okay, Fleming County still has those same reports. Okay, good to know. I've seen a few of the new ones, but I wasn't sure if it had gone out to all the counties. So we'll take a look at this, and I'll reference this later. So your phosphorus. So here is an example of a soil test report: 277, very high. Potassium 288. That's about right, exactly on target. Magnesium 166. Honestly, if this person were in a high tunnel, I would say leave it as is, because what we tend to see in high tunnels is that the magnesium tends to creep up a little bit, even if you aren't applying magnesium. It's happened even here in Lexington to my tunnels. So you can see that there's just a little bit of potassium being recommended. They're actually recommending some more magnesium, although I would say this is pretty good in my opinion. And 30 to 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen prior to planting. And we'll go into these recommendations a little bit more, but make sure to tell your county agent or write it on the bag, or however you operate with soil sampling. If you send it to Waters Lab, please make sure that you clarify what you're going to grow, and they will give you the proper recommendations. And pay attention to, so here we see soil pH 5.9, right? That's a big deal. So they said lime, see below, because they're gonna give you a 1.5 tons per acre of 100% effective lime is required, right? So they gave some more recommendations here. So make sure to read it all. This report, right, it's kind of boring. I think they've started to spice it up a little bit with more color. Certainly Waters Lab has lots of flashy colors, but make sure you read it through it and understand what it's trying to tell you. So the point of this slide is to demonstrate to you that it's really important to be consistent with the labs that you use, because this was the same soil sample submitted to 2 different labs. I did this as a little test here. So pounds per acre of phosphorus 105, pounds per acre of phosphorus 82. Potassium 471, potassium 480, magnesium 427, 418. So it's, some of it's really close. The phosphorus is in my opinion quite a bit off. Let's see, cation exchange capacity quite a bit off, 15.5, 12.44. Soil pH 7.5 versus 6.99. That's a pretty big deal. Zinc is about the same. Organic matter's pretty close. So you can see things are close, kind of, but not exact. And so as long as you're consistent with your lab, so submitting a sample to the same lab year after year is important for comparison's sake. And so you can keep your records straight and you can compare, right? Like if you see something off in the report, right, you can go back and say, okay, it was, I guess it has been creeping up, right? My soil pH has been creeping up every year. Okay, that's normal. Versus if you switch to another lab, you should take that maybe with a little bit of grain of salt, right? Because it may just be their testing methods. And that's not to say one is more correct than the other. It's just to say that as long be consistent. And their machines are calibrated differently, their methods are slightly different, and just keep that in mind. So recommendations or guidelines for tomato and pepper crops. So all of this information, so for those of you at your county offices, you can probably swipe one today if you haven't already. There's a new ID 36, the commercial growers guide for vegetable production. It's the 2022-2023 version. It looks like this. Has some nice, lovely green tomatoes on it. So almost all of the guidelines that I'm going to talk about today are in this ID 36. So recommendations for phosphorus, and this is across the board for all vegetable crops, is between 30 and 60 pounds per acre. Recommendations for potassium, again, for pretty much all vegetable crops, 200 to 300 pounds per acre. No yield increase has been shown by having more than 60 pounds per acre of phosphorus. And I think particularly in our, very price increase times, that's an important thing to really pay attention to, because a lot of times I know that people apply a complete fertilizer, something that has NP and K, right? And perhaps they bought it at Lowe's and that was the easiest thing, or it was the most readily available. But they do not need that phosphorus, and that is not going to help you beyond 60 pounds. You are not going to see a yield increase. You are not going to see a benefit. And in fact, you may complicate your system even more. So pay attention to that. Recommendations for magnesium for pretty much all vegetable crops, it's in the 200 pound per acre range, but the pH does vary differently. And so tomatoes and peppers are about the same at 6.5 to 6.8 soil pH. If you need to raise the soil pH, you will have to apply lime at least 6 months prior to planting. And that is one of the reasons that I recommend that people apply in the fall, or test in the fall, so that they can get this test back and prepare for, the potential of needing to either apply lime or apply sulfur. Sulfur, it can take up to a year to have a full effect. So if you need to lower your soil pH, you'd be applying some sort of sulfur product. And I've had a conversation recently with one of these agents on this Zoom call. So we talked about that at length. And so something to keep in mind. So for nitrogen, typically what we recommend is 90 pounds per acre of nitrogen prior to planting. So that would be a broadcast application. And then you'd follow with 30 to 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen post planting. You could do that as a side dress at fruit set, or you can split up into weekly applications, which I'll go into a little bit more. So soil nitrogen is not, again, is not part of the UK soil test. So we are basing this 30, so the 50 pound just pre-plant, that's standard, and then 30 to 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen. This is actual nitrogen. And so we'll go into, okay, well, if what you have in your fertilizer bag is not pure nitrogen, right? We'll go into that so people can wrap their heads around that. So for organic growers, because I get these questions a lot. So I don't know if there's any organic growers or people that are interested in growing organic certified vegetables, but for organic growers, front loading all or most of the nitrogen fertility may be necessary, just because a lot of the fertilizers that are available that are organic certified, OMRI certified, are not water soluble. So this means that you're going to apply most or nearly most of your fertilizer pre-plant. That may be the case. Nutrients in organic approved fertilizers are often slow release, and I'll show you an example of that. If you would like to apply organic matter, that's fine. And it can be very helpful in moderating pH and adding nutrients. Be aware that it is not going to add nearly as much nitrogen as it will phosphorus and potassium. Also, please, please, please be aware of where you got it. If this is a new source, I would recommend testing that out on, plant some seeds in this compost and make sure they come up normal and there's no contamination. And I would also recommend that you get a compost manure test done, so you know what the nutrient status is of this particular product. And I will go into that. So here is an example of, so this is a 1008 nitrogen and potassium fertilizer with Ocean Organics kelp extract. This is a great fertilizer. It goes on really well. It mixes really well with the soil. But you can see 9% water salt insoluble nitrogen. Okay. So the majority of this is not going to be immediate insoluble nitrogen. No, it gets applied to the soil, and it's not going to be readily available for plants to take up, which is totally fine as a pre-plant fertilizer, because your plants don't immediately need that, right? And so just keep that in mind. I think all fertilizer bags have some sort of description like this, right? So the 1% of water soluble nitrogen of Nature Safe 1008 will provide green up in up to 7 to 10 days. The 9% water insoluble nitrogen will release nitrogen for up to 7 to 8 weeks. So, right, that's pretty much what you would need for a tomato crop or almost any other vegetable crop. And so just keep that in mind, right? It's not going to be immediate. With a synthetic fertilizer, it is almost immediate. It is water soluble. It is readily available to the plant, like calcium nitrate, for example. So just keep it in mind. Guidelines for lettuce and other leafy greens, right? Same pK, magnesium. The pH it can be a bit lower for lettuce and leafy greens, 6 to 6.8. And the nitrogen requirements are similar to tomato. I would, in this case, me personally, I do not normally apply this full amount of nitrogen. I think it really does depend on the leafy greens that you're growing. If you're growing lettuce that can be repeatedly harvested from, this cut and come again lettuce, then yes, I think you absolutely would need full applications. And we will go into how to split it up, weekly applications. If you're growing head lettuce that is one harvest, like we did here, I would say 50 pounds per acre is sufficient because it's only in the ground for about 6 weeks. And we got beautiful, wonderful lettuce and did not need this full amount. But again, if you're growing kale and you're going to be harvesting all season long, yes, go ahead and use and apply all that nitrogen. That's going to be your steady source of nutrition for the plant. Cole crops, so your broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, all that stuff. Again, similar recommendations for P and K and magnesium. You want a pH at right around 6.5 for optimal pH or optimal crop production. So you can do 50 pounds per acre of N before planting, and then 30 to 50 pounds per acre when heads begin to form, like a side dress, or apply 50 pounds and then apply 50 pounds per acre 2 weeks later after head formation. Or you can do 50 pounds per acre pre-plant and then 10 to 15 pounds per acre of nitrogen weekly when heads begin to form, up to 100 pounds. So those are two options there. You can, depending on your setup and how you prefer to apply fertilizer, that's an option. So sulfur is not a micronutrient. This is mislabeled, but 10 to 20 pounds per acre of sulfur is typically recommended for cole crops. And so my recommendation would be, if you know you're going to be planting cole crops, have them test for sulfur and boron for sure, so that you know if you need to apply, right? You don't want to over apply these things, right? And so 2 pounds per acre of boron. You certainly do not want to apply more boron than you need to. 10 to 20 pounds per acre of sulfur. So here's the manure and compost testing. So I think I've also discussed this with one of your county agents. This is what the test would look like. So you get, basically here is what I'm looking at, this 1.5 to 2.6. So this is the NPK of poultry manure. And as you can see, N is the least of a supplied nutrient in this case. So the potassium is the highest percentage available here. So again, soluble salts, just real quick, if you're in a high tunnel, request soluble salts, it'll show up like this. This number may not mean a whole lot to you, but if you can keep track of it year after year, you can see if it starts to creep up. And basically what if this was 1 or above, I would be concerned, basically. So keep an eye on that. Basically, soil salinity is a measure of the soluble salt content. So the anions and cations that are soluble in water. Contributors, it's not just sodium when we're saying salinity. We're talking about, yes, sodium, but magnesium, potassium, calcium, nitrates, chloride, sulfate, those are all contributors and can make salts or are salts. But also salts originate from the weathering of soil minerals. So some of that may already just be naturally in your soil, but then you can increase that by bringing in fertilizer, right? So calcium nitrate, nitrates, right? And because high tunnels are typically covered throughout the year, precipitation is not able to affect the soil as it does in the open field. So we don't struggle with soil salinity here in Kentucky because in the open field, because it rains. It rains a lot. And I lived in New Mexico for a chunk of time, and they do struggle with soil salinity because it doesn't rain. And their water has a lot of minerals in it as well. And so think of a high tunnel as kind of an irrigated desert situation, similar to New Mexico. And the nutrients in the salts may build up near the soil surface or the crop root zone. And so that can have negative effects on crop development and yield. So the soluble salts test measures the electrical conductivity of a water soil paste. And that EC of a soil is a representation of the amount of dissolved salts from the soil. And so it's looking at all these guys here. So why am I talking about all this, right? Nutrient deficiencies and toxicities can stunt plant growth, cause lower yield, no yield in some cases, or even plant death. So here's some examples: magnesium deficiency, classic; excessive nitrogen, this white core, right? Manganese toxicity in coal crop seedlings, very sensitive here. These black speckles and this curling, very classic, right? So it's not just deficiencies that we need to be worried about, but also toxicity. So deficient nitrogen, that's probably something a lot of people are familiar with, can cause the yellowing of the entire plant, low vegetative growth, which could lead to sun scald of your fruit, right? If you don't have a lot of leaf protection. Deficient phosphorus can cause purpling of the older leaves. So we're seeing a lot of purpling right now because the soil is still cold. And so I wouldn't be as concerned about it right now just because the roots may be colder. If you're seeing this in your fields already, we see it too. And what it is the soil is cold, the roots are cold, and they just can't take up those nutrients right now. As soon as it warms up, things will normalize. So if you're seeing a little bit of purpling on your leaves right now, I would not necessarily be alarmed because of the cold temps we've had. Deficient potassium, the yellowing of the leaf margins, the edges of the leaves, usually in the older leaves first, and also can lead to uneven ripening, specifically in tomato. Deficient magnesium is that interveinal chlorosis, that yellowing on the lower, older leaves. Usually we see that again in tomato plants. So excessive nutrients, right? Okay, we talked about deficiencies. Now let's talk about excess. Excessive nitrogen can cause too much vegetative growth, right? Less fruit production, small root production, disease or insect pest issues because there's just so much vegetative growth. There's less air ventilation, there's less movement there. Plants are touching each other, so they're swapping diseases, pests jump from one to the other. Poor fruit quality, so that white core on tomatoes, the lovely ripening disorders, blossom drop. So I get usually a few calls about that a year, a few emails about that. Excessive phosphorus can cause an increase in chlorosis, so the yellowing in plants. It can also reduce the plant's ability to take up other nutrients like iron and zinc, I believe. Excessive salt can cause burning on the leaf margins and low yield. Excessive magnesium, can cause reduced uptake of K and cause uneven ripening and lead to yellow shoulder. So here's some fertilizers, just an idea, kind of nutrient content and what they can do, kind of what may happen with use of this fertilizer. So potassium nitrate is a 13% nitrogen, 44% potash. It can raise soil pH over time, but it is water soluble. Calcium nitrate, 15.5% nitrogen and 21% calcium. It can also raise soil pH over time, but it is water soluble. So a lot of our veggie growers use one of these two, or sometimes they alternate. Urea, very high in nitrogen, 45%. It can volatilize in high temperatures and can lead to lowering the soil pH over time. And this would be, many years of urea use, for example. But this is something to keep in mind, this volatilization. You don't want to lose what you've applied, right? And so if it's a really hot day, I would maybe consider using a different fertilizer. Ammonium nitrate, 33.5%, also can lower nitrogen or soil pH over time. Bone meal, it's going to have some ranges depending on the product. Usually somewhere in the low nitrogen, high phosphorus. So this is, most of our Kentucky growers do not have a phosphorus deficiency issue. And so this may not be the product for us here in Kentucky, because it's once in a blue moon when I see a phosphorus deficiency in a Kentucky soil. Feather meal, it's usually 12 to 13% nitrogen. It's in the organic spectrum of fertilizers. This one's one of the good ones for its relatively high nitrogen. It's going to be a slow source of N. It's not water soluble. Sodium nitrate, 16% nitrogen, acts like a synthetic fertilizer, but is approved for use in organic systems with some restrictions. You can't just use pure sodium nitrate all the time. There's only a percentage of it that you can use at one point in time. So be aware of that. Magnesium sulfate, that's the Epsom salts everyone knows and loves, water soluble, about 10% magnesium, 13% sulfur. Gypsum, 22% calcium, 18% sulfur. Usually used to, it's a great source of sulfur. You would broadcast this before you plant, right? Lime, depends on which type of lime you're using. It's primarily used to raise the soil pH, and as I said before, it will need to be applied months before planting. Elemental sulfur, again, there's a few different types here, used for lowering the soil pH, and it needs to be applied months before planting. Fish emulsion, not all fish emulsion is organic approved, OMRI approved, so just be aware of that. And the range really depends on the product, right? So NPK could be anywhere between 411 and 930. So just the thing with fish emulsion is it is a liquid, but it can certainly clog your emitters. So be very careful if you're trying to use it with fertigation. You may end up with a mess on your hands. Most people have to dilute it with water in order to get it through a fertigation system. And then manures and composts are going to vary widely. And so I highly recommend getting them tested. And for the most part, they're going to be a much higher source of P or K, not N. So if you're trying to hit your N mark, your nitrogen, this is not the way to do it. Okay, just a little bit more about organic fertilizers and what makes them organic, right? That may be a question that you're wondering, what is she talking about? Basically, they're carbon-based and derived from living organisms, such as fish emulsion, right? Or blood meal. Those are from organisms, compared to an inorganic fertilizer that doesn't contain carbon and is usually manufactured, or we call it synthetic, right? But those are often water soluble. Organic fertilizers are typically slow release. Microorganisms in the soil transform organic nutrients into plant available forms. So this can take days or weeks, as you know, the fertilizer package I indicated earlier, as that indicated, days and weeks. Not all fertilizers that claim to be organic are OMRI certified. So definitely look for this symbol and look it up. Make sure. Don't apply something just because the package claims Sometimes they have that OMRI symbol, but they can be applied with certain restrictions. So if that's important to you, definitely do your homework. Potential benefits of these organic fertilizers are the gradual release of nutrients. So you can kind of stretch it out, ensure season-long supply, right? Up to 8 weeks. Minimal loss to the environment because they're less soluble. So if you get a rain, it's not necessarily just going to wash things, leach things through your system. Usually also less salt injury, except perhaps in the case of sodium nitrate, right? It can also add organic matter to the soil, which contributes to the overall soil health and can increase the water holding capacity. It can stimulate microbial activity because the microbes actually have to do something, right? They're processing things. It can help improve soil structure and can provide, of course, valuable micronutrients to the plants. Drawbacks would be that nutrients aren't readily available for plants compared to soluble synthetic fertilizers. They usually have a lower NPK. So that means you have to apply more to hit your target. Often nutrients levels are more equal, so you may be supplying nutrients that are not needed in order to meet the demands of another nutrient. Typically, we're trying to hit a nitrogen demand when we don't need phosphorus, right? And so that leads to an over application of phosphorus. And many times they are more expensive compared to inorganic fertilizers. So how to calculate the fertilizer you need, right? This is where your agent can help, but you can do this at home, and this ensures that you are not applying more than you need. So typically your soil test is going to come back as pounds per acre. Maybe for the garden folks out there, it's going to come back as pounds per 1,000 square feet or something like that. But maybe for people that are pounds per acre, maybe you're only applying you're only growing a quarter of an acre or something like that, right? And so you need an exact amount. How much do I apply to this area? So the formula listed on a fertilizer bag gives the percent by weight of the major nutrients in the bag. So 12%, for example, in this feather meal case, 12% of the bag is nitrogen, 0% is phosphorus, and 0% is potash. So you're going to multiply the weight of the bag by the percent to get the actual nutrient content of each bag. So if it's a 50-pound bag, you're going to multiply that by 0.12, right? The percent of the nitrogen. So 6 pounds of nitrogen pure nitrogen is contained in that bag. So let's say you have a high tunnel, because those have some odd dimensions that usually require conversion to get your fertilizer just right. So a 30 by 96 foot high tunnel is approximately 0.07 acres. So for a tomato crop, let's say you need 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen pre-plant, and you want to use that 1200 just as an example. So you're going to divide the desired rate by the percent in the bag. So 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre, right? That's your rate. That's what you're trying to hit, divided by this percentage of the bag, 0.12, is going to give you 416 pounds per acre of feather meal. So if you were growing if you needed an entire acre, if you need to fertilize an entire acre, you would need 416 pounds of feather meal, but you don't. You only need 0.07 acres. So you're going to multiply this number by your actual area, 0.066, to get 27.5 pounds of feather meal for that entire high tunnel, right? So this would be your pre-plant application, and that would be a broadcast applied to that entire interior of the tunnel. So what if you have a quarter of an acre for bell peppers? Same thing, 50 pounds of per 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen pre-plant is recommended. Let's say you're going to use manure, right? You want to use that poultry manure that I showed you before, 1, 1.5, 2.6. So again, you're going to divide the desired rate by the percent, not in the bag, but in perhaps the truck, the dump truck of manure. So 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen divided by 0.01, that is the nitrogen content. 5,000 pounds per acre of poultry manure. You're going to multiply that total per acre by the desired area, which is only 1/4 of an acre. So 5,000 pounds per acre times 0.25, 1,250 pounds of poultry manure for that 1/4 of an acre. So manure is a complete fertilizer, so you're applying P and K as well as N, even though you may not need it. So just out of curiosity, right, just to show you how much P and K you would be applying. So if you applied 1,250 pounds, I'm multiplying by the content of this manure, right? You're also applying almost 20 pounds of phosphorus and over 30 pounds of potassium. And based off your soil test, is that something you really need, right? So here is a way to, fertigation is a way to slowly apply nutrients as the season progresses. In vegetable production, we recommend drip irrigation anyway. And so for most people, fertigation should not be much of a leap. I think there's a lot of very complicated systems out there that intimidate people and make it seem like this is not for them or they can't do it. It can be very basic. We have nothing fancy for our high tunnels for fertigation, but it is basically irrigation plus fertilization, right? That's when I say fertigation, that's what I'm talking about. And it is a method of applying fertilizer directly to a crop through an irrigation system. Normally I'm in my head and when I'm speaking, I'm talking about drip irrigation because that is what people should be using for vegetable production. You do need a water-soluble fertilizer, or in the case of fish emulsion, dilute it down seriously, so it's basically water. So water-soluble meaning that it's dissolved in water. So the post-plant fertilizer application for a tomato crop, let's say it's 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen throughout the season, right? So usually we would say apply that once a week after transplanting, 2 weeks after transplanting, go ahead and start fertigating for most of the growing season. So you're going to do calcium nitrate, 15.500. That's the what's on the bag, right? I'm just giving the high tunnel amount again. So a 30 by 96 high tunnel. But let's say, so we're not really talking about that complete interior of the high tunnel. There are 6 beds that are 2 feet wide and 85 feet long. So that is a much smaller space, just over 1,000 square feet. 48.5 pounds per acre of calcium nitrate is what needs to be applied over the course of for an acre of calcium nitrate. So that would be weekly if you were doing an acre, right? But we're not, we're only doing 1,000 square feet. So that is, I got this number from the recommendations in ID 36. So there is a table in there, and that is the example it gives. That's like a moderate application of calcium nitrate. So convert your 1,000 square feet into acres. I just like working with acres. You could do it the opposite, I guess. Convert this into pounds per square feet if you wanted to. And then you multiply your recommended rate, 48.5 pounds per acre of calcium nitrate, times your acres, which is 0.023, and you get 1.14 pounds of calcium nitrate applied weekly to your high tunnel. So this is 1.14 pounds over these 6 beds weekly. So if the entire high tunnel is planted with the same crop, you can also calculate based off the number of plants in the high tunnel. So again, this is coming from ID 36, 11.5 pounds of calcium nitrate per 1,000 tomato plants. So this is based off an 18-inch spacing. And this is again from ID 36. So there's certainly not 1,000 tomato plants can fit in a 30 by 96 high tunnel. At least I hope no one's trying to do that. So how much fertilizer per plant? 11.5 pounds divided by 1,000 plants. So a very tiny amount, 0.012 pounds of calcium nitrate per plant. Okay, well, how many plants do you have, right? Look, let's say 400, that's pretty crammed, but let's say you've got that. So 4.6 pounds of calcium nitrate applied weekly to those plants, right? And so you've got a really tight spacing. You may want to, we would need to adjust this number. It's going to be more. So keep that in mind. Okay, so we've talked about calculations. How do you choose the right fertilizer for you? So in my mind, it would be based off your soil test results. Compare the results to the needs of your crop and do that. But I know that's not what people do. And I myself, I have my favorite fertilizers. This is what I use, right? And I'm sure a lot of people are that way too. But let's say you're starting out and so you don't have a favorite. So let's go from nutrients needed. So what does the soil test result indicate? What is the nutrient content of some fertilizers you've been looking at? And do you need everything that is in the fertilizer, right? So that comes back to that complete fertilizer. You probably don't need phosphorus. So, don't use that. Application method. The pre-plant broadcast may be your only option. Usually that is not the sticking point. It's normally the fertigation water soluble thing. Do you need something to be water soluble, and do you have the setup for fertigation, right? Also, production philosophy, this comes in, right? Do you only want to use locally sourced amendments? Are you certified organic or trying to become certified organic? So do you need OMRI certified products, right? Those are all very important questions. And price point. How much are you able or willing to spend? Maybe your preferred fertilizer from 2 years ago is just now so expensive that you just can't imagine. Consider shopping online, and if the shipping is outrageous, talk to your neighbors about going in. Usually shipping is much more affordable if you buy in bulk and split the cost with someone else. So consider that. It's also usually the cheaper per unit when you buy more of something. And so consider that as an option. So from my standpoint, annual soil testing absolutely needs to happen. Look at and be sure to understand what the soil test is telling you. And be aware that the guidance that you get, the recommendations you get, is only as good as the sample you have collected. So if you did a haphazard job on sampling, your results are going to be questionable. You can calculate how much of a particular fertilizer can be applied. It's super easy, super straightforward. you can have these slides after this and refer back to them. To be quite honest, sometimes if it's, you know, at the beginning of a season and I haven't calculated it for a while, I have to think about it. So don't feel bad about that. Math is not my #1 subject of choice. Consider manure and compost testing for more precise applications. If you have an issue and you say, well, I applied, you know, we will ask, your agent will ask, I will ask, what did you apply? And you say, well, I applied manure. Well, how much did you apply? You know, if you can't answer that, if you can't give us a number or how much, you know, what the nutrient status was, and you also don't have a soil test, there will be a lot more questions from us than answers, unfortunately. So just be aware of that. And with that, I will take any questions people have. Should a grower do tissue samples during the growing season? I would say for a commercial grower, that is a great idea. UK does not currently do tissue testing. It's $25 for tissue sampling, tissue testing with Waters Lab, I believe. But I would highly recommend if you've never done this before, to make sure you do it correctly. So check out Waters' website. I also have a YouTube video that does a quick tutorial on foliar sampling, and I'll pull that up for you. But that is a great, for commercial growers that are trying to hit their target, foliar sampling is a great option. But again, the results are only going to be as good as your test, as good as your sample. And so if you've not done a great job with sampling, your results are going to be questionable. Other questions?
Folks, you're welcome to come off of mute if you're on Zoom. Does anybody here in Columbia County office have any questions? Oh, we have a question.
If my soil pH is
Can you
too
come up
high-
here and ask it in this? You're fine.
If your soil pH is too high, is there any way to lower it? I mean, I understand that if you add stuff, it takes a year for that sulfur, but is there anything you could add now to?
So yes, so the question was, if your soil pH is high and you didn't, you know, you don't have the time, you don't have a year, right? I would go ahead and apply the sulfur. It will lower it a little bit. It just won't lower it. So basically, when we do lime and sulfur applications, we're calculating it to your desired soil pH, right? So if you have a 7.2 soil pH and we say, okay, we're shooting for 6.5, we're going to tell you to apply X amount of sulfur to get it to 6.5. When you apply it, it is not going to immediately drop to 6.5. It may drop to, you know, within the first couple of weeks. It may, I don't know how quickly, but it may drop to 7.1 or 7, right? And then over the course of a few more months, it may drop to 6.9, 6.8, right? And so it's going to be a gradual thing. So I would still do not despair, do not throw up your hands. Go ahead, apply what you need to apply, but just be aware that you may, it's not going to be immediate. Does that help? Does that answer your question? There is nothing immediate. There is a liquid lime. It is also still not immediate for raising soil pH. What is the fastest way to get soil pH up? There are elemental sulfur is, I believe, the fastest sulfur product. It may be the most expensive. That's going to lower. To raise the pH, there is, I think hydrated lime, if I'm not mistaken, is the fastest at raising. Also more expensive, of course. Let's see. Any other questions? I'm trying to watch the chat. I think I've got them all. And yes, I will send the agents a copy of this PowerPoint so you can refer back to this.
I have a question.
Yes.
If you used raised beds for like strawberries and lettuce crops and stuff like that, is it still a really good idea to test yearly, even though you add like bags of Miracle Grow and stuff like that for the extra dirt each year?
Yes, I would still test. So if you think that your raised beds are more potting soil than soil, we also have a media testing, and that might be more appropriate for you if you've used a lot of different potting soil and amendments. You may want to do that instead of regular soil testing, but UK has that, and so does Waters. And so that would be a media test. And so you just talk to your agent. Hopefully they're listening to this too. And it'll come back in a slightly different format than your regular soil test, but it's still very valid and helpful.
Okay. Do you take those the same way as you would a regular soil test?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
I don't think we have any more questions right now, but if you all do, please let us know, let your agent know, email me, call me. It doesn't matter, however you want to get a hold of me, and we'll definitely reach out to Dr. Rudolph and find out an answer for you. We're happy to do that, and she's always very quick to get back with us and helps us out tremendously. So, all right, last call. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Rudolph, for being on this evening. We greatly appreciate it. And to go on with what she said too about the manure testing, that is a $25 test through UK. So check with your agent to see, because each county has different budgets for being able to send in soil and manure and that kind of stuff. And so they may add an additional cost for shipping on top of it. So just check to see what that is, but it's at least $25 for manure testing. And we do send that off quite often. There's a certain way to test or to sample your manure as well. So we can send you instructions on how to do that too. So. All right. Well, if that is all, again, April 28th is our next training. That will be the senior and WIC training. Some big changes, I think, coming this year. So just watch for more information from me in your email. I'll send out reminders about it. And again, there's 3 locations that you can attend live, and that is Fleming, Lewis, and Round counties, or you can join via Zoom, either always. However is best for you is okay to attend. And other than that, if anybody needs one of the ID 36 commercial vegetable growing books that was discussed, just let us know. Folks here in Fleming County that's live, we do have some here. Those that are on Zoom, just get with your agent and we can get you a copy of those as well. So without any more questions, I guess we will go ahead and call it an evening. Thank you all again. Thank you again, Dr. Rudolph. We greatly appreciate you, and y'all take care and enjoy your evening. It's actually sunny for once.
Yes, enjoy. Thank you all.
Thank you.